So I'll be presenting in a combination of Portuguese and English today. So, hola. I actually paid Trevor a little bit extra to get a viral marketing campaign of my slides to be flashed earlier today. So that was to build anticipation for the event. So I think you're all wondering now, what is platform socialism? It's all you were talking about over coffee and drinks. I'll also need, I presume this works. So we've heard from some amazing workers, amazing technologists, and now we are down to the bottom of the food chain, the academics. I sometimes feel like a little bit of a parasite because we obviously research people, we need people to research. So if you find me coming up and talking to you, you should beware because you might get a little parasite attached to you that is then wanting to know everything about what you do to write papers and research articles about it. But in all seriousness, I do try to work as much as possible with cooperatives. I help them write grants. I try and donate my services to them so that we can have this much more healthy and beneficial relationship between all these different groups that are so important. I'd like to thank the organizers. It's such an amazing and professional event. I'm really thrilled to be here. I said yes in about 10 seconds, and I'd really love to learn more from all of you. And if I don't come up to you personally, it's because I don't want to interrupt your wonderful conversations in Portuguese. But please do come up to me, and I'd love to talk to you more. So I'm here to present some ideas from my book, Platform Socialism. Let's see if this works. I'll send you a PDF for free if you want one. But if you want the physical copy, I can't get that to you. You're going to have to buy it online or something. So we see here 4 logos that are now essentially owned and controlled through dual-class share systems by 2 men, right? And just today, we've seen the calamity and the chaos that can be caused when the tech billionaires are put in charge of what is our social digital infrastructure, right? 4 apps owned by 2 men. Now, I think this really speaks to the benefits of the cooperative model, the necessity of emphasizing how this cooperative model could work. Now, I think because I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm going to go quickly over my critique of digital platforms and move very much towards some suggestions for what we might want to do about them. But very briefly, I think the central issue, despite the very different business models that digital platforms have, is that the way in which they are constructed and designed is to extract value from the value-creating activities of others. Now, this is kind of drawn from some insights from Italian or autonomous Marxism, but it's also picked up by a statement that I read in one of Trevor's reports, that this idea of crowd fleecing, right? You're not crowdsourcing, you're basically skimming a little bit off the top, right? You're the digital middleman that comes and connects parties. Now, those parties could be connected and stay together, right? But they'll ensure that the digital gatekeepers keep taking fees, subscriptions, and keep extracting value from the communities that they purport to serve. Now, of this value capture model that I think that is really essential to how the platforms operate, we can delineate three key ways in which this works. Firstly, they're rent seekers, right? They benefit from having rather than doing. They're not about creating wonderful new products and services, despite what they'll tell you. They're about charging you a little bit for maintaining their platform and living in their world. Secondly, we see 2 countervailing movements, a concentration of profits. We saw digital platforms taking in record profits during the pandemic and beyond. And at the same time as profits and money is concentrated into the hands of fewer and fewer shareholders, we see the social risk and the responsibility that is involved in having a workforce, maintaining decent standards of work and infrastructure. All of this is pushed away, right? The risk is personalized, individualized, as per the neoliberal model. If you're a Deliveroo rider or an Uber driver, it's you who pays for any injuries you have. It's you who pays for sick days, holiday, right? There's no minimum wage. Finally, we see that the platforms operate with this network effects, right? This is why, in many respects, it's so hard for other people to challenge the dominant players. The more users you have, the more data, the better you can make the service. So we end up having these giant behemoths that dominate the industry. Now, of course, few of you would dissent from these points, so we need to try to move on a little bit as well. But just briefly, we can see that the ambition of these tech giants, if left to their own devices, is really to create an entire digital and offline world in which we would have to live, right? When we think about the metaverse and some of the concepts that are being put forward by these digital barons, it's really about creating corporate-controlled environments in which you spend every waking minute of your life, that every time you move from work to conversations with your friends, to your entertainment and leisure, it's all going to be in a hybrid offline digital world where they'll be extracting value from you at every point in the system, right? Now, there's a lot of disagreement over what the issue is, what the problem is. Some people think it's about polarization of our politics. Other people think we're addicted to social media. But obviously, as cooperators, we're all in agreement that there is a fundamental issue of power, ownership, and control, right? What kinds of tech gets produced, how it gets made, how it gets designed. These are questions that have essentially to do with who owns the platforms, right? Who benefits from them? What value do they receive? So when it comes to the kind of what I see as like the humanist critique of these platforms, that we just want our CEOs to be more ethical, that we need people to basically just switch off their social media devices, right? This kind of humanist ethical critique, it ignores the underlying political economy of how these platforms operate, right? Of the constant need for growth, for more users, for more surveillance, for more data, right? It's not a question of the moral consciousness of any particular CEO. There are structural incentives that lead them to operate in this way because of how they must operate in data markets. I have a lot more time for the primarily US, but also increasingly European agenda of antitrust or anti-monopoly. This idea that we need to break up big tech. Now, I think that we really do need to increase regulations on these companies. We need to tax them more. We need to have super profits and potentially prevent them from growing above a certain size, either in user base or market capitalization, the total value of the company. But in addition to this, and again, I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think we need genuine alternatives. We need a different kind of model with a different ownership structure where the incentives are much more invested in the various stakeholders of the cooperative. So what I think that we need to do is start focusing on what these socially owned alternatives would look like. And I think platform cooperatives have a really big role to play in this. So the book is called Platform Socialism. Here, as like a bending the knee to my conference organizers, I'm going to call it the Cooperative Plus model, right? As a kind of trying to show the ways in which it draws so much on cooperatives and other forms of social ownership. What I'm trying to do with this model is thinking about different forms of social ownership of what I call digital assets, but we could think of as the infrastructure, the companies, the technology, all of these things that make platform cooperatives what they are. So platform socialism, I think, is really geared towards how we can think about different types of social ownership. How can we, and so the principle that I draw on here is thinking about the different types of communities that use these platforms and then trying to tailor governance models to suit those various communities. Because I think one of the issues with how we think about social ownership is we tend to have a very binary view. We think about state ownership as like this old school socialist model where the nation state owns a particular company, that they own the gas, the water. Or we have syndicalism of workers' control, that the workers of the factory own and operate the factory themselves. And so I think both of these have their place. But I think what we really need to think about is how we can actually expand the range of options that we have of different types of social ownership into what is a much broader ecosystem of different types of cooperative ownership for different layers or sizes and types of communities, right? And so this is kind of trying to expand our imagination for thinking about different forms of ownership and governance structures that we might consider. And this is kind of like one of the main theoretical contributions of the book, right? This notion of like an ecosystem. So let me tell you in a bit more concrete detail about how that might operate. So firstly, at the local level where you have geographically based services, I think workers' cooperatives and platform cooperatives are fantastic, right? All of the benefits that we know from them get delivered. You eliminate this idea of a multinational corporation extracting value from communities. Value stays within communities. And so there are so many different things. We've got Up and Go, we've got domestic cleaning services, courier services, so many of these fantastic examples. But I think the question really is, when you start to think about scaling, and this is the theme of the conference, right? So I think it's a really interesting and fascinating topic. I think it gets a bit trickier, right? I think a workers' cooperative model is not necessarily fit for purpose for larger and more capital-intensive organizations, and certainly not for global organizations, right? Because you can't turn Facebook or Twitter over to the employees alone. You need to, at the very least, start talking about some kind of multi-stakeholder model, right? Some kind of user democracy. And here's where I think it gets really interesting and where we have a lot of opportunity for innovation and for thinking about different ways in which we could do things. So one of the main points that I want to make here is thinking about how workers' cooperatives can be supported and integrated into various forms of municipal structures. So local government, right? Regional government, local government. Obviously, this will depend a lot on the particular geographic region. But I'm very inspired by the new municipalism movement. We've got some colleagues here from Barcelona, for example. There's been really inspiring political movements that have sought to decentralize and devolve power from the level of the nation state down to more mayor's bodies and city governments and this kind of level. So we can think about certain forms of administration or platforms that we actually might, for democratic reasons, want to see integrated into city governments, right? So when it comes to things like transportation, for example, ride-hail platforms, when it comes to things like short-term rental accommodation, we actually might want to see local governments that are democratically elected to have some say over this, right? Because it's not simply about the workers, it's about a public service and a public infrastructure that we would see as like a public good. We would want cities to have these things, right? And we would also want city governments and democratically elected governments to have a say over how this kind of short-term accommodation worked, right? That it didn't suck up too much property from the long-term rental market. It didn't lead to over-gentrification, to over-touristification. You know, these are big issues that we might want democratic governments to be involved in. At a larger level still, there are services that we might want national governments to deliver, right? This would depend a lot on the size of the nation state. But things like healthcare, childcare, you know, a lot of these we want universal services that perhaps they could run through a platform, but they might want to be at a larger scale. And finally, I think at the level of the international, we have some really interesting questions, right? Because I think we've seen that a workers' cooperative at least would need to be modified slightly to think about how that would work. But I think when we look at the two largest examples of platforms, when we think of a internet search engine and a social media network, we really need to move into vastly new territory to think about what could a form of social ownership look like in that situation. How could Twitter's users, rise up and govern it themselves? What would that look like in practice? And is it even realistic or viable to even begin to discuss that? Is it just going to be passed around from one billionaire to another? So there's lots of really interesting questions there. And I think that there's a couple of, important points about cooperatives that we need to consider when we think about how we might scale them up and how cooperatives might operate at this local level. So I think these are all, quite familiar to us. We've had these conversations before. We know about the various barriers that cooperatives face and why they might be unsuitable for certain larger capital-intensive industries, finance, competing against private firms, the legal and regulatory systems that they face. Where I'm teaching, originally I'm from Australia, but I work in the United Kingdom, and we face a particularly inhospitable environment for cooperatives, right? People don't know about cooperatives in the UK. We don't have the same culture and background that we have, and this is, I guess, why it's so exciting to come to places where there is a much more thriving culture. So we know these barriers exist, and they're kind of slightly different in different national jurisdictions, but there are ways we can overcome them and things that we can do. Now, I spoke before about how municipal authorities are really key to thinking about fostering a good environment for cooperatives to operate. That starts at the level of the legal and regulatory system. In the UK, at least, a cooperative cannot register with the same organisation as a normal corporation, right? They have to register with an entirely different institution. It costs more. It's more difficult. You need to know more. So simplifying the systems through which that work is really important. We also have seen a real improvement with the number of people that know about cooperatives and the number of cooperatives in the UK when Cooperatives UK, which is the national body for co-ops, started a small incubator called Unfound. And so these kind of programs, it's like one person with a very limited budget. They only have like 6 or 8 people every kind of round, but something like that, and these kinds of programs and the kind of work that the PCC and many others are doing are essential to getting these people off the ground, right? Because people need the money, they need the training, and they need to have a supportive ecosystem within which they can work, right? Because that kind of support, cooperatives are not going to survive on their own, right? They need a very hospitable environment to have the education support and indeed sometimes like actual office space, right? There's another experiment in London was supported by my local council, Islington, and for very cheap rent, they have leased a large office space for 10 years for the cooperative sector, for digital cooperatives. And so now that is a home to many new businesses in the region. And so, yeah, this is my third point, that these municipal authorities can play a really important role. And I sit on one of the boards and we have meetings and we, tutor the cooperators. We have discussions about how their business model is working, what they need to do. There's many staff in the council that are on board and involved in these kinds of discussions. So I think scaling this up even more, because the incubator doesn't have a lot of money. So I think what we really need is to see large national funds that are essentially cooperative banks, right? That are there to feed capital into the cooperative sector, because this is so crucial. And I remember when I was at the 2019 cooperative conference in New York, that was basically like the biggest question on everyone's mind, that how do we get access to capital? And so these questions are really important. I think one of the answers to that has to be national funding, right? I think that there are others, there are many interesting innovations in this sector, but if you want a large amount of money on the table and you want people who have that, it's national governments. So that is kind of my suggestion for that kind of space. think I'm going to skip that. So I want to go straight to the most difficult case studies for this kind of framework. What I've begun to talk about today is kind of big picture stuff. I want to put forward new ideas for thinking about how we can push the envelope of social ownership, of cooperatives, what cooperatives could look like at scale. And so I'd like to talk about the hardest cases, international, right? And the reason why these are the hardest cases is because what essentially we're talking about is how to democratize a platform, right? How do we have democracy operating in a sphere where it has been almost completely absent, right? And so we're talking about democracy at an international level. Now, as we all know, all too well, like democracy operates very imperfectly, you know, and with a tipping my hat to Trevor, I was so very, very imperfectly at the national level, and we're basically inexistent at the international level, right? So how, and one of the questions I always get is, perfect, you know, how isn't this just utopian pie in the sky dreaming, right? Well, democracy doesn't even work at the level of the nation state. We basically are electing fascists every second election. How could this work for the level of the platform? But I think there are some starting points, right? And so let's start with a search engine. So here, my suggestion is that we need one single public search engine that receives funding as a not-for-profit foundation, right? So I think you have different options. You have kind of marketplace of search engines. For the case of what we have here, I think you basically just need a public Google, right? You need a Wikipedia-styled search engine. And I think the fact that we don't have, you know, an access to the world's knowledge that doesn't go through the funnel of an advertising platform is just insane. I think that if Wikipedia didn't exist, we wouldn't have any kind of models at all for what this kind of thing could look like at the scale that it exists. So when it comes to public search engines, I think that you can look at the example of what Google does. And the interesting thing about this is Google was functioning very, very well as a socially useful good before it even started its advertising arm, right? One of the key problems that we face when we're talking about, well, how do you make like a socially useful Deliveroo, right? Because the whole model is just garbage, right? It's just there to exploit workers and, you know, give customers their food as quickly as possible. But in the case of Google, they were doing a very useful thing before they even invented advertising, right? Before they even knew that advertising was going to be how they would pay the bills. So I think when it comes to a public search engine, we need to start having an open public debate over how ranking algorithms work. They shouldn't be a trade secret. They should be, you know, we should have access to what kind of ranking algorithm, what the code is, first of all, and then what the principles are behind it, how it functions. And we should have a public debate, right? Maybe this is too Habermasian of me to think that this is possible, but honestly, that is like a very important point that we need to start thinking about, right? That how do you get these kind of public debates happening over what the ranking algorithms do? And if it's a for-profit company, it's just a closed door. We can't even start the conversation because there's no way they'll give us a trade secret like that. But I think if you did have a Google that was not-for-profit, that we supported the movement towards supporting that kind of foundation, that would be basically a step in the right direction, right? That we could have conversations about the algorithm. We could talk about how you have value-sensitive design, where you're thinking about what kinds of values are getting encoded into the system as you're doing it. And I think there would still be many issues with that in terms of like people trying to game their algorithm, search engine optimization stuff. But it was still a political question, right? How we organize the world's knowledge is a political question. It can't just be there in a neutral way, right? We're always going to have some kind of ranking, and whether that's personalized or not, whether that favors certain types of large websites over small ones, these are conversations that we have to have, right? When it comes to social media, though, I kind of move in the opposite direction, because I think we having like an international Facebook or like a national government-run social media, I think in terms of the issues of like political surveillance and their access to secret police and all the rest of it, I don't think that is a good idea. So I think essentially when it comes to social media, we need to take advantage of the affordances of the technology, which is actually distributed, right? Which can run on open protocols, which can run on what the internet used to run on, right? When we had email browsers and people could communicate with each other because they all use the same shared and open protocol. This is a bit ominous. Is this the beginning of the coup? I haven't even started yet. Give socialism a chance. That's what's wrong. We haven't tried socialism enough. And so, when it comes to social media, we actually have working prototypes of this. Someone already mentioned Mastodon the other day, right? So Mastodon is one application, which is kind of like a Twitter clone, although it is very different from Twitter in certain applications, but it exists within a broader sphere of the Fediverse, which is like a federal universe. Small, often not very well funded, but primarily open source applications, which exist for various forms of communication and exchange, messaging services, kind of message boards, all these kinds of like communication technology. And so this federal framework that we have in things like Mastodon. Mastodon is basically like the most well-known of a kind of dark well, not a dark, but a largely unknown world. It's very undark, actually. It's almost the opposite. And so we can use this kind of technology not to create one large entity, but rather to proliferate the various types of applications that we use. Because when it comes to the fundamental principle of interoperability, when things can operate with one another, then it doesn't matter what server that we're on, we can communicate with people on other servers. And this allows for a much more decentralized, much more local model where people in specific servers can decide themselves upon the various rules that operate, the kind of etiquette. It can begin to look a lot more like Reddit sub-communities, right? Rather than like one global provider doing everything and getting yelled at. Now, obviously with a model like this, there are various pros and cons. Content moderation becomes an enormous issue, right? Because it's not just a political question, it's also a huge burden, right? How do you get every small community group running their own content moderation? Are they going to need to be at the cutting edge of every single, purportedly extremist group in the world? Are they going to need to understand every small sign and gesture of like alt-right and far-right movements about what various symbols and words mean? Content moderation, as all the big providers have found, is very hard to do. And so this is a really big issue, and people who talk about alternatives to Facebook, alternatives to social media, often get caught up on this idea of content moderation, right? So do you get like civil liberties groups and NGOs that might provide content moderation services to these communities? This is one possibility. Do you perhaps create tools that will allow people to, for example, screen automatically for child pornography, which is what all the large platforms do. But then that doesn't solve the trickier problems of, difficult political decisions. Well, I didn't get a ding for the 5 minutes. Where was the ding? I was listening for the ding. Now I've got 1 minute. Okay, that's okay though. I can wrap this up in 1 minute. One of the reasons why a lot of these services don't work very well is because they don't have any funding, right? Most of them are built by like 1 or 2 volunteers doing it in their free time. And so of course they're buggy. Of course the user experience isn't great. This is why I think when we're talking about these things, we need to talk seriously about these national innovation funds, people that can get paid to produce more open source software that people use. You probably don't realize that various tools that you use are themselves, open source software. And very good. Finally, of course, the big elephant in the room, not the Mastodon logo, but the other big elephant in the room is the difficulty of getting people to switch platforms, right? Because we're in that phase right now. Elon Musk has bought Twitter. He's fired half the staff. Half of my Twitter friends have, joined me on Mastodon, right? But, they don't know how bad it is. Like, Mastodon is it's very hard to find people. It's very hard to find conversations. It's very hard to use these alternatives at the level that they are now. Now, I'm still a big believer in Mastodon and the principle of what it stands for. Yep, time over. But I think we're a long way to go. So thank you for your talk. Please come talk to me afterwards. Email me. I'll give you a free PDF of the book if you'd like. And thank you very much for listening to me.